you know? We so already know what the Conservative Party is. What is the Conservative Party? It's a political party which is the major representative of the ruling class, of the British ruling class, British capitalism. And bound up in that apparently simple definition, that apparently simple sentence, are at least three very basic and critical contradictions. The first is that political parties seek election. That political parties seek election, and that the interests of the ruling class are obviously a minority interest, right? That, for the very most part, a wide electorate are not represented, do not benefit from the interests of the ruling class. So this is a basic and critical problem for the Conservative Party. From this, we can say that the Conservative Party is opposed by default to any extension of democracy, by any extension of the franchise. That the Conservative Party, is opposed to the very concept of democracy itself. And we do well to remember here that in the recent general election, and I can't help but say that phrase without half breaking into a smile. In that recent general election, I think there was a single tweet from the Conservative Party encouraging people to register to vote. A tweet in April, I think, which was encouraging armed forces to register to vote. So the Conservative Party is opposed to democracy. That's the first point. Nye Bevan, that famous Labour minister, post-war minister, he said lots of things about the Tory Party. He famously called them lower than vermin. But I'm more interested in something slightly more subtle and slightly less provocative that he said. This rhetorical question: how can wealth persuade poverty to use its political freedom to keep wealth in power? Herein lies the whole art of conservative politics. So let's have that in mind. Contradiction number two is that the interests of the ruling class are not uniform. This is for several reasons, not least because competition is a basic requirement of capitalism, a sort of central mechanism of capitalism. And in many senses, we should see the Tory Party as a site and space for ongoing discussion about capitalism and about how best to serve the interests of capital. Right? And the third contradiction, and these three contradictions I want you to keep in mind as we go through this shoddy stop-start history, is the conservative bit of the Conservative Party. Capitalism isn't conservative. Capital is Philistine. Capital tears through whatever green space it can find. Capital is blind to tradition, right? There's very little conservative about capitalism. It conserves the wealth of a minority. That's pretty much what it does conserve.
I knew I'd call it chaos. I was trying to keep around.
Yeah. So despite the sort of reputation and stereotypes and cliches of the Middle England voter, the Conservative Party doesn't really represent them either. So these are the three contradictions I want to keep in mind. In terms of talking about the origins of the Conservative Party, that isn't a very clear thing or an easy thing, and this is for at least three separate reasons. The first is that those who call themselves Tories in, say, the 16th or 17th century have very little obvious trajectory to those who call themselves Tories in the 19th century. There's not an obvious lineage there. And by the by, we do well to remember that Tory originates as an insult for an Irish cattle thief, and we also do well to remember that capitalism itself has its origins in cows, capital, cattle. So capitalism is all about cows. Is a major takeaway point from all this. Right? The other two reasons are also important to stress. We can't really even talk about political parties in any modern sense until the latter third of the 19th century, I guess. And the Conservative Party also, unlike, for example, the Labour Party, has no written constitution, which again is arguably paradoxical or counterintuitive for a party which seeks to preserve tradition. Yeah? Nevertheless, it's clear that we should start our story somewhere in the very early 1830s. It's around 1832 that the name, the Conservative Party, is first proposed and adopted. It's also in 1832 that the Great Reform Act, so called, which changed so little and so much, came into being. The Great Reform Act, a really kind of quite trifling bit of legislation which did a bit of reform, right? Which got rid of so-called rotten boroughs, extended the franchise by about 300,000 to about 800,000. Was the first bit of legislation actually to formally ban women from voting. Historians are very keen to evoke 1832 as somehow the beginning, the beginnings of Britain's march to democracy. It's a very tentative one. It's a very bourgeois one, but nevertheless, let's roll with it. We also have to bear in mind that this reform didn't come out of nowhere. We're talking about, especially in 1831, we're talking about the sacking of jails in Derby. We're talking about buildings on fire in Bristol. The ruling class does not see ground out of the kindness of its collective heart. Right? And the other reason we should talk about the 1830s as a start point, or a vague start point for the Conservatives, or the Tories, is because of the 1834 Tamworth Manifesto, a desperately dull document, a document which we can somehow take as a foundational document for the Tories, a document released in Tamworth in Staffordshire by a man sometimes evoked as the first ever modern premier, Robert Peel. It's a really cripplingly dull document, this, but I would point to one sentence which reminds us of contradiction 1 of the Conservative Party. In this key sentence, what I take to be the key sentence of the Tamworth Manifesto, there is moaning about a perpetual vortex of agitation, that public men, note men, can only support themselves in public by adopting every popular impression of the day. Right? This is the Conservative Party in its foundational document, or one of its foundational documents, moaning about the fact that it has to, in some way, engage with the wider public. Right? And here's what I want to say about all this, is that no sooner had the Conservative Party emerged as, or began to emerge as something approaching what we would recognise as the first modern political party, no sooner had the necessary conditions aligned in such a way that the Conservative Party began to develop, then we saw the first major crises in that Conservative Party. Crises which, again, can absolutely be understood in terms of these contradictions which are built into the Tory party, contradictions which are manifestations of the contradictions of capital itself. Right? The first major Conservative Party crisis, and this is, again, desperately dull stuff, it's GCSE history stuff. The first major crisis of the Conservative Party, which saw them lose power in the 1840s, was a result of contradiction 2. That is, the fact that the interests of the ruling class are not uniform. We're talking here about the debates over the Corn Laws, and I'm wilting inside having to talk about the Corn Laws. Right? This is the sort of history which we had rammed into us again and again. But we should understand this, the Corn Laws, as nothing less than bitter dispute about how best to serve capital. We're talking about debates over tariffs on imported grain. We're talking, that's what we're talking about.
Although Tories are trying to starve people.
I'm coming on to that, yeah. These are...
What debates were they?
Well, they're debates which were blown up by the British-created famine in Ireland, yeah. And I'm coming on to imperialism.
Sorry.
No, that's fine, but I'll be coming on to imperialism very soon. And it runs as a connecting thread throughout. We're talking about ruling class squabbling over grain and imports, and arguments which are desperately exacerbated by this British created famine in 1845 in Ireland. Right, this is a really dull debate, the protectionism versus isolationism debate, in which landowners obviously supported the idea of tariffs on imported grain, whereas dynamic modern industrial capitalists opposed such tariffs. The point being, right, that the issue was exacerbated by imperialism, and also, right, that this was the first major blow-up of the Tory party. It was a blow-up which saw Peel repeal those laws, repeal the Corn Laws, with non-Tory support, but nevertheless the party split and lost power. Right? So we have a Conservative Party which apparently is unassailable, which apparently is the first modern political party, and nevertheless eats itself over questions of grain. So there's that early contradiction, that early moment of Tory party infighting. And here's another one, 20 years later. Another Reform Act which we might preface with the phrase so-called. Right? The 1867 version of the Reform Act, another Reform Act which gave as little as could possibly be given. A Reform Act which again was prompted by a wider public, by which we mean a significant protest, including an invasion of Hyde Park for a rally, for a significant rally. We're talking about a Reform Act which about doubled the franchise. And again, you see two major Tory party takes on the idea of extending the franchise. You have, on the one hand, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, who says as follows: it may be good, it may be bad, but it is a revolution, and therefore should be opposed, right? Even if it's a good revolution for the Tory party, it should be opposed, it's change. Opposed to this, you have the young Benjamin Disraeli, the rising star of Toryism, the mercurial Benjamin Disraeli, about whom I suspect we all know a tiny bit, right? Who thought that the electorate would be grateful for an extended franchise, who thought the electorate would be grateful to the Tories for an extended franchise. And yet this new franchise in the next election returned William Gladstone's Liberal Party. So let's just very briefly reflect on the fact that the Tory party, even in its burgeoning modernism, is fairly committed, it seems, to eating itself at the same time. The evoking of Benjamin Disraeli allows us to take a step back and a step forward at the same time and think about imperialism. A central theme when it comes to the Conservative Party. It was Disraeli who made Queen Victoria Empress of India in 1876. It was Disraeli who the year before made great play and celebration out of buying significant shares in the Suez Canal Company. You've got to celebrate what you can. What we're dealing with here is the fact that a party of capitalism, especially a party of British capitalism, has to be a party of empire too, because capital has a requirement for constant growth, and as any good Leninist does know, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. What do I want to say about this? I want to talk about a very specific component of imperialism. I want to talk about Ireland, right? From the late 1880s, the Conservative Party found itself in a sort of pact with the Liberal Unionists, who themselves had split from the Liberals. They were Irish Home Rulers. By 1909, the Conservative Party had adopted what is still its full name, the Conservative and Unionist Party. By 1912, there was a proper merger between the Unionists and the Tories. Right? There are two things here. One is that Ireland is always critical when it comes to the Tory party, because Ireland was Britain's first colony. Ireland, being Britain's first colony, is, as the historian Duncan Hallis reminds us, therefore central in the story of British capitalism. Ireland has a very, very special place in the story of British capitalism. And we also know, right, that it was this full title, this full unionist title, that was on the front of that wretched Tory Party manifesto a few months ago. A return to its unionist credentials, seemingly out of nowhere. This is, by the way, a Conservative Party which is very, very bad at keeping the union together. You know? It's doing its absolute best to end the union, and isn't it a wonderful thing to watch? But you know, I mean, I think a lot of people for the first time might be wondering, well, why is Northern Ireland even a part of the United Kingdom? You know, and of course, the other thing about Ireland is it complicates questions of domestic and foreign policy. You know, does Ireland count as you know, which of those two things does Ireland count as? You know. Because of the time constraints I have, I'm going to make a reckless leap over the First World War, if that's all right. We can talk about that in questions. Because it's really the Conservative Party that emerges from that First World War, a First World War which, again, Lenin reminds us, is the result of capitalist competition. It's the Conservative Party which emerges from that First World War which very much interests me. You know, we have out of the industrial slaughter of 1914 to 1918, we have a British Empire which is bigger than ever before, which ought to be a boon for the Conservative Party. We also have a re-energised, highly successful Tory Party, successful in terms of its electoral machine, right? Running on a new electorate, speaking to a new electorate, 75% of whom haven't ever voted before, and for the first time including women over the age of 30. We see in between the two total imperialist wars of the 20th century, we see a highly successful Tory party electoral machine. We have 5 very, very successful clear majorities for the Tories in this time, especially huge in 1924 and 1931. We see the Tories polling at times as high as 55%. These are indeed glorious years for Toryism, golden years of Toryism. But if this were a book, that phrase, the golden years of Toryism, would probably be followed by a question mark. You know how historians like to do that? They like to put sarcastic punctuation dotted around in subtitles, that kind of thing. Because if the 20s and 30s were a high watermark of Tory electoral success, they were also a time of bitter resistance, as in the general strike of 1926, in which a couple of million workers downed tools. It's secondly a time of bitter Tory party infighting. Here we go again. This is contradiction too, over imperial preference, and I'll talk about that in a second. It's a major crisis time of capitalism, as in the 1929 Wall Street crash. And it's also a time of electoral recklessness, of confidence and, I guess, an apparently unassailable time of hubris and recklessness, something which isn't really very conservative, I guess. I'm thinking here of how, at the end of 1923, a Conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, sought, with a clear majority, sought an even bigger majority. He sought to run a single-issue election, in which, you see where this one's going, he sought to run a single-issue election over protectionist tariffs, resulting in the loss of that convincing majority, and resulting in 10 months of Labour minority government. Running single-issue elections isn't really ever a good idea, especially if the opposition party choose to ignore that central issue on which the election apparently is being fought. And I should just very, very briefly point out that in the 20s and 30s, the major source of Tory angst, the major source, indeed, of this single-issue election was questions over tariffs for Britain's linked-up colonial world. So again, like before, we have questions of tariffs and questions of preference and trade preference being magnified by the very fact of empire. By the way, it's in 1922, 1923 that the British Empire is at its all-time high in terms of geographical reach. I'm going to recklessly jump over another total war, if that's all right. Because once more, it's the Tory party which emerges out of World War that I think is of interest to us. Because for all the electoral preeminence in the decades that preceded, in the 20s and 30s especially, the Tories lose an election during the Second World War. This seems to me a very, very important point. So much for Churchill, saviour of the West, so much for war being good for the right. That's something we're told an awful lot. That war is a great boon for the right. Instead, as we saw in Ken Loach's film On the Spirit of 45, you have Churchill being roundly booed during election campaigns in 45. We do well to remember that the Tory party did not contribute any evidence in 1942 to the so-called Beveridge Report, that report which sought a blueprint for a post-war world. A post-war world which would include, for example, a National Health Service. The Tories contributed no evidence to that investigation and subsequent report. Throughout the 50s, and despite a return to power again in 1951 as a result of Britain's faulty and shoddy and corrupt electoral system, despite that, the Tories find themselves in quite a bind. It's in the 1950s that the Conservative Party most clearly align themselves with the interests of capitalism, actually. It's in the 1950s, I would argue, and as John Ramsden, who wrote a very, very good right-wing history of the Conservative Party, a fantastic book, as John Ramsden points out, in the 1950s, all of a sudden you see the Conservative Party really showing its colours, really talking about capitalism. Not just in kind of small things like introducing competition into broadcasting, but also refusing to support the nationalisation of road haulage, for instance, right? Or iron or steel. You see a Conservative Party at considerable odds with the electorate on which it rests. You see a Conservative Party committing fully to capitalism, or openly committing to capitalism in the 1950s, whilst at the same time butting up against a post-war zeitgeist, if we're going to call it a zeitgeist, which has more to do with welfare than private capital. But again, a steadfast party of capitalism will encounter all three of our central contradictions, exemplified well, I think, in the burgeoning discussions in the 50s and 60s, and then obviously in the 70s, around European supranationalism. And what I want to do here is think quite seriously about a key face of 60s conservatism, Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell is perhaps, well, no doubt most famous for his racist speech in 1968, which we'll be noting 50 years of next year. I think Enoch Powell emblematizes so many of these contradictions of Toryism. In a scathing obituary of Enoch Powell, Paul Foote once described Powell's kind of rabid commitment to the free market. The fact that he quite literally worshipped the free market, by which I do mean the phrase literally. Enoch Powell was known to thank God for the free market in church, right? That's creepy. That's really creepy. Yet Powell was also a vehement opponent of the EEC. Was the foremost conservative opponent of the EEC, which obviously Ted Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister, would take us into in 1973. If you are a rampant free marketeer, European supranationalism is very good. It locks a whole bunch of countries into a free market world. It stymies all sorts of attempts at nationalisation. It is not good for welfare. It is not good for public spending. And yet Enoch Powell, at the same time, opposed the EEC, despite being a committed free marketeer, over sort of weird nostalgia for empire kind of stuff. This is, Enoch Powell in the late 60s absolutely emblematizes the central contradictions of the Conservative Party, of this small c, big C Conservative Party thing, seeking to represent racism and represent willful nostalgia for empire, whilst at the same time apparently being committed to the free market. And I think we need to think more about Enoch Powell actually in terms of our discussions over Europe. Ted Heath, who in the 70s took Britain into the EEC, also describes capitalism's conflicted interests. Elected in 1970 on an anti-consensus ticket, i.e. a ticket which was committed to allowing failing businesses to fail. No sooner had he been elected, made a number of U-turns, a number of famous U-turns, indeed on intervention, on state intervention, indeed on propping up failing industry. Ted Heath thought unemployment was wasteful. He thought unemployment was bad for capitalism, and was infuriated by the wastefulness of a lot of deregulated British industry. And he also caused considerable schisms because of Europe, pleasing the free marketeers, but antagonising those kind of small c conservatives who would make sort of pleas in the direction of sovereignty. Someone who didn't care much about the unemployed was Margaret Thatcher. In the 1970s, you see developed this narrative about a British disease, about a broken Britain, to use a kind of more modern phrase. You see continuing anxieties about a broken Britain and continuing agitation for a smaller state. And by the way, right, it's one of the sort of paradoxes of authoritarianism, right? That those who talk about a smaller state tend to use the state in quite a brutal way. Those who talk about a small state seem to quite often, end up putting troops on the streets. And we carry on. They developed this narrative in the 70s, which was, I think, shamefully exacerbated by the left no less than the right, that Britain was broken, that there was a need to destroy collective bargaining, there was a need to control inflation through the suppression of wages, and that we need to accept high levels of unemployment. Right? And at first, this kind of Margaret Thatcher narrative was too much for an awful lot of capitalists, because Labour in the 1970s was doing a very, very good job at driving down wages too. And we have to bear in mind, I've been talking throughout about the fact that the Conservative Party as the party of British capitalism. The Labour Party has always been the B team, right? The Labour Party is absolutely a party of empire, absolutely a party of capitalism too. The Labour Party is very, very good at representing the interests of capitalism. Let's see how that goes as we, in the coming years. And it's very, very. As soon as we start talking about Margaret Thatcher, it's very easy to start getting very, very pessimistic. The thing I always think about in terms of Thatcher, the most important thing to know about Thatcher is that phrase of hers, that economics is the method, the purpose is to change the soul. A phrase which sends so many layers of shivers down my spine and other parts of me. Economics is the method, the purpose is to change the soul. And it's very easy on the left to get pessimistic and dejected about Thatcher. To say that yes, she did successfully change the soul of the nation. And to point to Blair, point to Blair as the person who consummated that soul, consummated that new consensus, that consensus which insisted that everything was best run by people, the sort of people who run Marks and Spencers or whatever. And yet, have the Tories ever been strong? Have the Tories ever been strong? For sure.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I think they have. have. Yeah.
Well, let me say something provocative, and then we can talk about it in a minute, right? Have the Tories ever been strong? Even Margaret Thatcher, even a weathermaker like Margaret Thatcher, was driven out through a combination of, as usual, it's very easy to make it a narrative about Tory party infighting, but at the same time, these were contradictions exacerbated by us, by our side, by the protests over poll tax. Even Margaret Thatcher, the apparently unassailable Margaret Thatcher, was driven out under the weight of the very many contradictions of capital. Let's think about the Tory party at the moment. Let's think about the Tory party at the moment. It's fun. After their first very slim majority in 20 years, they blew it from an apparently unassailable position, collapsing under the weight of their own inner contradictions. Let me offer this tentative rule, and it's I'm just an optimistic kind of guy. Right? When the Tories look apparently strong, they soon fall apart. It is when the Tories are at their apparently strongest ebb that they collapse under the weight of so many contradictions. And it's all very well talking about these contradictions, but it's always our job to ensure that this happens. Always. We can talk about Thatcher being brought down by an internal coup, but this internal coup would be nothing were it not for what happened as the 80s bled into the 90s with the poll tax, right? Let's not bother talking about John Major, and that's fine. We've gone over half an hour already, but I think this very kind of selective and reckless history allows us to understand the present moment as a perfect storm. Perfect storm point number one. As a party of British capitalism and of union, the Conservative Party has done very, very badly. One referendum almost did it in for the union, and now another referendum, another gamble has gone very badly and pissed off British capitalism. Point two, this referendum was indeed, the EU referendum was indeed called to settle Tory party infighting. Right? It was called to settle kind of Eton debates. This is contradiction too. Yet it turns out that when you put Eton debates to a wider electorate, sometimes we have different ideas. Point three, Ireland is back. Ireland is absolutely back. Ireland, the island of Ireland was, and all the kind of colonial anxieties about Ireland was desperately complicated again by the referendum and by questions of the border. Throughout the election, we had constant irresponsible mention of the IRA. The IRA is back as well, by the way, apparently. And now we're lumbered with the dodgiest of dodgy deals over the DUP, right? So austerity was a lie. Point four. This Tory party implosion is caused by a disconnect with the electorate. The idea of this referendum was a performative gesture, right? It was a gesture in the direction of democracy. It was one which was apparently a done deal, and yet the thing about kind of Tory party infighting, the thing about Eton debates, is that very often old Etonians don't have a very good sense of class, or they have a very good sense of their own class. It turns out when you put Etonian debates to a wider electorate, indeed an electorate for whom the interests of the Conservative Party are not for the most part their own, surprising results happen. Point five is authoritarianism. When you kind of strip it away, what have you got? Really bad authoritarianism, actually. I mean, that's how I would describe. If we're going to talk about a Mayism, that's kind of how I would describe it. It's like really bad authoritarianism. I want to be iron leader, naked before the populace, shouting about strength, shouting about stability, but demonstrating precisely neither. Because again, and I'm going to use this is probably going to be the last time I use the word contradiction this evening, because again of the inner contradictions of our own party and of capitalism, but also by virtue of being opposed, by being genuinely opposed by Jeremy Corbyn, yes, but we have to bear in mind too that the Corbyn project if we can call it a project, is born out of, again, the movements, right? It's born out of us. Jeremy Corbyn, as Labour leader, is born, that wacky thing that should never have happened, that was born out of a demo, an anti-austerity demo, very nearly a bit over 2 years ago now, called in the wake of what was at the time a disastrous election, right? And what do you know? It's happening again. And I guess just the other sort of point I'd throw in terms of this perfect storm is the dementia tax, which maybe we've all kind of long since forgotten about. But that was another prime example of a Conservative Party seeking to represent capitalism. The dementia tax was kind of meant to be a new product for a new market, allowing Richard Branson to kind of buy up your life. But what do you know? It turns out that actually the dementia tax, this new product for a new market, was at desperate odds with the principles of small C conservatism. It was a classic example of capital being blind to tradition and what's proper, if we're going to call it proper. I appreciate this has been a wildly hectic and stop-start thing. Really, we needed about 7 or 8 hours for this,
Do justice. Do proper justice.
but I think the point is that history, if we try and do history properly, is in constant dialectical relationship with the present and indeed the future. Right? We try and recuperate the past so as to make the world afresh, make the world anew. And I'd like to think that we can, in some part, understand the current mess of the Tory Party, have the Tory Party as being strong, by redeeming and recuperating and rereading the history of the Tory Party itself. And if what I've just said isn't cause enough to hit the streets on Sunday and exacerbate those contradictions even more, and make the world afresh, I don't know what it is. But I'm going to end here because I've gone on far too long. Thank you so much.